So welcome back. We are continuing to talk about community and individualism, which is sometimes called heteronomy and autonomy. That is, heteronomy stresses the community and autonomy stresses individualism. And we're recognizing that there are strengths and limitations in both approaches. In relation to God, there can be an overdependence on our relation to God. That is, God will work it all out instead of taking responsibility that God calls us to. And in relation to God, there can be an underdependence where we do it all in our own strength without listening enough to God and waiting patiently on God. Just as in relationship with our parents, there can be overdependence on parents when someone who's 40, 50, 60 years of age is still depending on their parents for all their decisions. And then there can be underdependence where a person is not listening at all to their parents. And in relation to one teacher or scholarly author or theory that you read about or that you listen to, there can be an overdependence on one teacher where you accept everything they say. And then there can be an underdependence where you accept nothing that they say. And in relation to self and your past experiences, you might reflect on and acknowledge your past experiences and be overdependent on them, and you can be underdependent on them as well. So the balance is needed between dependence, overdependence, underdependence on God, parents, teachers, scholars, and self and others, and also on the society that you live in. Societies tend to often be collectivist or individualist. And so the United States, Western Europe, Australia tend to be individualist, and cultures such as China, Korea, Japan tend to be collectivist. And as a couple of you have said, it's important to recognize that the collectivist society is not all wrong, and we individualists are not all right. Traits of collectivism, they encourage to conform to the society, to recognize the importance of what the society does, and this promotes stability and obedience. And I think some churches and some schools and some classrooms are wanting to promote everyone cooperating, working together. We don't want dissent. Whereas individualism, such as our society, might have the alternate viewpoint. Asian companies tend to be collectivist, like the country in which they live in, and harmony and loyalty are said to be very important. At the same time, Martin Luther, I think to some extent, and certainly the Enlightenment, have brought an emphasis on the value of individualism and autonomy. And many of our universities and tertiary education institutions see the value of individualism and autonomy. In the individualistic culture, the emphasis is on the success and achievement of the individual, and often there is greater reward, though that can sometimes be questioned. So it's worth thinking about, is your family collectivist or individualist? And are your views persuaded by collectivism and individualism? Matilda, do you think your family has been more collectivist or individualist?
Very collectivist. I'm from a family of 10 people. So I've got 8 kids and 2 parents in my family. And if we were to work, individually as a family unit, it would kind of it would just not work at all. We'd have to have separate bedrooms, separate everything. But ever since I was 4, I've been sharing a room with 6 other girls. So we had to learn how to work together in a team. So, yeah.
What a great example, Matilda. So thanks for sharing us that. And then sometimes individualism can be seen as selfishness and sin. But at the same time, we've also said that individualism can be seen as taking responsibility. And so it can be viewed in different ways. So it's important to recognise that some students and teachers are naturally more inclined to individualism, others to collectivism, some to task, some to relationship, and some to grace, and some to judgment. Be aware, students and teachers can have different approaches, and there can also be considerable differences between those who focus on individualism and collectivism. So individualism and collectivism can be like the parts of the cell, and when those individuals run riot doing their own thing, it can be like cancer. And we can ask why America and Australia are more individualistic or communal. Then there is the danger, of course, collectivism, that some people may make a lot of noise and saying it's amazing how much gets accomplished when it doesn't matter who gets the credit, but there can be a lot of other people getting the credit. And I think that's true of much of what we do in society. So what are the advantages of interacting with others in a group to make decisions? Firstly, the more people you interact with and the greater diversity of views and viewpoints, the potential greater diversity of ideas and resources. So diversity can be helpful. However, as Matilda was sharing, the more people you have, the more viewpoints and opinions that can make things more challenging to work through. When you engage the help of a number of people, that gives a greater range of viewpoints, and that's a bit like a tripod having the legs a long way apart. So if you've got different viewpoints, and if doing an assignment you interact with different viewpoints, then that will help you to get more stability, as opposed to just one viewpoint, which is much less stable. You can walk away from that one stick tripod and hope it will stand up. It would be much harder to do. Group decision making promotes greater interest from everyone who's there. So in your class, if you get the class to discuss and make a group decision, then that'll have benefits. People will be more fired up, more interested. So even if you don't have a group of experts, you can get everyone making a contribution, and that'll be helpful. Thirdly, true group decision making creates greater understanding and ownership. That is, when people participate, they think more, they get involved more, and they are therefore owning the decision more. And by engaging the entire group in a decision, you'll create a greater acceptance of the outcome. Fourth, group decision making creates an opportunity to collect all the collective contributions. So everyone's got something to give, and it brings a variety of perspectives. So the average decision by a single individual is partial and biased, whereas the average decision by a group should have the greater range of viewpoints. 5, group decision making takes advantage of relationship building and team building opportunities. So people who work together are likely to continue to support one another. And the process creates secondary advantages, including the skills of each team member slowly being transferred over to other members of the group. 6, group decision making promotes the idea that collective thinking is beneficial. 7, group decision making increases the strength of an organization because it recognizes that there's lots of people contributing in many different ways. So it builds the strength of your classroom. It brings a sense of acceptance, but you've got to realize there'll be some who want to dominate. They need to be encouraged to give other people a go. There'll be some who will be shy. They need to be encouraged that they can find safe space and opportunity to express themselves. By increasing the strength of the entire class or the entire team, the organisation will benefit because the executive leadership of a group is only as good as the people who are given opportunity. Many people will be unwilling to take a risk because of exposure of the final outcome, and so there can be problems there. So group decision making is a process that allows the team to take responsibility for the risks, and so that can be helpful. So there's lots of benefits when you get a team to work together. And so many students will say, why do we have to do group work? What you're doing is you're teaching them of the benefits of working with others, and you're teaching them how to overcome the difficulties that are faced. Certainly, because there's different people, different views, you'll have to clarify the goals and roles that people have, and you'll have to establish group roles where people are going to work together. So they'll need guidance. And today's business world is about collaboration because there's a lot of people working together. You need to develop a spirit of cohesive working together so that people won't be working against one another. Spirit of cooperation will be needed. But what are the disadvantages of group decision making? One is that it's going to take time to get people to understand how to work together. And so you'll need some way to speed the process up. And this can be overcome by setting deadlines. Second, another disadvantage is that irrelevant opinions and ideas may come forward. And so if you've got a team in a hospital, something may never get done. If you've got all these different directions people are going in, if you've got a team planning a church activity, too many different directions are going to be a problem. Third, some people refuse to share their perspectives. They go shy and they've got all of the good ideas and resources. Fourth, different people can have different priorities. So group decision making, you need a number of ideas that are going to come together, and some people are going to want different things for different reasons. And then five, the choice of the members can affect how people fit in. Six, accountability, which is what we began by saying we don't like group because the whole group gets reward. Think about some of the ways that you can overcome that. I think is that you might give 20% of the mark to the group, but 80% or 60% might go to the individual contributions. So even though the group might get a distinction, some people in the group might get a high distinction, others might only get a pass depending on the contribution they make. And so you still get a mark for the group work, 20, 30, 40%, but you give the majority of the marks for the individuals in the group and what bit they do. I think that would help combine the different outcomes, and it would avoid slackers who are over dependent. 7, group decision making can result in overuse of authority by the group, and so the group thinks everything's going well because they've got 6 or 8 people saying so. They can get too excited about the power that they think they have. 8, group decision making can cause everyone to think that they are leaders with great authority, whereas they really don't have much power. 9, people in a group can just rest and go with the flow. So that's the big problem, I think, is when people are just riding along on the coattails of others. So Ruben, as a result of going through those things, what do you think we could quickly summarize in a sentence or two? What are the strengths and limitations of group work or group decision making?
Okay, so in group work, it can be strengthened because of your variety of viewpoints, which means it's going to be applicable to a wider group of people if you do it right. However, at the same time, because of those different priorities and perspectives, the tasks can be taken in multiple different ways, and if there is a lack of communication, accountability can detriment the group or lead to the detriment of the group.
So good. So it's there's the benefit, you've got the variety, and then the problem is the lack of accountability there, and that can lead to problems. Let me introduce you to a really great model. Has anyone seen Tuckman's model before? Hand up if you have. So Tuckman says, whenever you form a group, firstly, you come together as a group and say, we're going to plan this church activity, this school activity, this school excursion. There's a huge amount of interest at the beginning. This is the honeymoon period where the two people come together or the group come together, and it's going to be amazing. And then after a period of days or weeks, just as the two people who come together, there's going to be the storm. You do things differently to me. So the storm is when the problems arise, because the differences become apparent. Thirdly, Tuckman says the best way out of a storm is, rather than quitting and kicking people out, is to work through the norms and to state clearly, these are the norms that we agree to. So some people sleep in and don't arrive, others get there early. The norm is we will start at 8 o'clock and we'll close the door at 1 minute past 8. So the norm is set. Once you've got your norm set and you're starting to work together well, you can start to perform and then you can rest and adjourn. So that's his theory, norming, storming, or storming and then norming. So Tuckman's model is very successful at showing that a group will look good at the beginning and then it'll think it's a team, but problems will emerge, and then it'll start to work through ways of handling the differences. It'll then become a real team as people know what they're doing and know what their position is, and then they will perform well, says Tuckman. So each step builds on the previous one. You've got to go through the storm before you get to the next stage. So the forming stage, you come together, you've got a goal, you've got an atmosphere, the honeymoon period, and the analogy is guy meets gal and they think it's going to be wonderful. Second stage, the storm. Guy discovers, doesn't totally agree with everything girl says. Girl discovers, guy doesn't totally do everything they say. Or the students that you've put into a group discover that some are slackers and some are too loud. And so you got the storm takes place. So conflict, competition. Someone wants to be the hero. Someone wants to move into this area or that area. No longer do we have a safe, pleasant work environment. We got people wanting to do things their own way. Individuals. Suddenly the things begin to have different views, conflicts arise. And some go silent, some dominate, some want their own way. That's the storm, inevitable, says Tuckman. And then the third norm stage is when some people begin to think it through, the bugs begin to get worked out, and they say, well, you've got all the voice, you could stand up, be our spokesman, you've got great ideas, let's work with those. You're a bit shy, let's listen a bit more to what you say. So when things begin to get worked out, and this is a bit like Lord of the Flies, this is a bit like a number of movies that have been made and books written about the way in which things get worked through. Things are starting now to have stated norms, and that's the best way to work things out. So guy meets girl, they've had the storm, they come together and they agree, this is the way things will be done. And so you may have lots of ideas there on how guys and girls can start to get on with each other rather than storming all the time. Isn't it interesting the way opposites attract? So the shy person looks for someone who's a bit more outgoing and enthusiastic, because that's a wonderful alternative to their shy world. And the outgoing, enthusiastic person looks for the shy person because it'll be a little more peaceful. Yeah, so I think it's fascinating the way opposites can sometimes attract. And then adjourning, performing, things go well, and then adjourning, you can now rest in it all working out. This raises the question about the size of the group. If a group gets too big, certainly you get more viewpoints, but it can be more challenging. And then smaller groups, you don't have that greater range. Group size can make it challenging to get cooperation. Smaller group may have more cooperation. So this can ask, what's the best size for the groups? And sometimes you might have pair share, just 2. Other times you might have 3 or 4. The bigger the groups, then the more group dynamics you're going to have to work with. So sometimes I think you need to experiment with different size groups at different times. And in a class, try 2, 3, 4 in a group. And at other times, try 6 in a group. But you'll have more group dynamics to work with as you get more, I would think. Strategies for teachers to make groups work. First, assign students to groups rather than having them self-select, and try and get a good mix that you feel is what is achieving what you want it to achieve. So there's going to be a danger if students self-select. There'll already be expectations dynamics. Secondly, don't grade just the final product. Have a number of other aspects of the work that are going to be graded. Considering grading individuals on their constructive critique of how the group is going and what's happening. Increase accountability for individuals. Increase accountability for progress at different stages. Set up a virtual classroom group page where people can put up the different things that are being done by the different members of the group. Start with positive feedback right at the beginning. Say, this is great. I like what you're doing, even though it's a mess and they're just beginning. Strategies to make groups work rather than allowing students to privately criticize. Make the feedback public. They've got to speak to the whole class, and they've got to say some positive things for everything negative that they consider. Allow some time in class for group meetings and make yourself accessible. Strategies to make things work. Don't squeeze the project into just a few weeks. Consider the amount of time that's really needed and give additional time. So recognise that group work can be valuable for developing cooperative learning and recognising the value of social independence. Recognise that scholars say this can help develop a greater awareness of physical environment, social environment, maturation, and that it can fit with Jean Piaget's theory of cognitive development. That is, we learn through working with others, and it can fit with Vygotsky's theory that cognitive development requires an awareness of how to get on with others, and that if knowledge is social, then we learn from our engagement with cooperative efforts. So sometimes it seems easier just to do individual work, but there can be a lot of value in formal and informal group work. And Janice has written a great deal on the notion of group thinking, such as Vietnam War and Bay of Pigs. And Janice says that the trouble with groups is that they have an illusion that everyone gets on with one another when really people are not expressing their doubts. Unquestioned beliefs are held, rationalizing. So there's a lot of problems with groups not admitting to the problems that are existing, and there's an illusion of vulnerability. And have you ever felt pressured to do something? You're part of a group. 1986, the Challenger orbiter, they knew that the O-ring would not work below 53 degrees. They knew that it was 36 degrees on the day, but the president of the US was going to make a speech in which he was going to mention the rocket launch. Ronald Reagan, because he was announcing the launch at the Union address that night, they couldn't back out. They launched it and kaboom, it blew up, and these 7 people lost their lives. So groupthink is dangerous when everyone thinks the group's going the right way. And you can think in a class, if you've got a group of students who are going walking, they may get themselves into trouble, and they might see a river, and if the group thinks the 6 or 8 students can cross the river, then they could all get washed away, and you'll have a lot of trouble explaining to the school, you know, where are my students? Unfortunately, they seem to have got washed away, and we don't have those students anymore. That will be difficult to explain to their parents. So you need to avoid groupthink dangers. Cause of groupthink, the group identity tends to dominate, certain leaders influence, low knowledge can be pressed, and stress can be a problem. So negative groupthink is a real problem, and there are a lot of problems associated with negative groupthink. So be aware of the dangers of groupthink, and be aware of the benefits of avoiding the dangers of groupthink. I just want to briefly mention also that as individuals and groups, we have power and we have authority. And in the classroom, you have both power and authority that have been given to you by the government, by your training, by your position. And you can describe some of the sources of power and authority. Can I get you all to write down now, what are your sources of power and authority as teachers? And there is group power and authority, and there is also individual power and authority. And this influences the ways in which you think. And if you lean too much on the power and authority of your group and don't realize the limitations of it, or if you extend what you think is the power and authority you have as an individual, then that can lead to problems as well. Let's think for a moment about the power and authority that you have, because these are core concepts that help us understand what is going on in a class and in a school. Different people have power and authority, and parents have power and authority in relation to their children, law and legal power and authority. There's lots of sources of power and authority. Yeah, Josiah, what do you think are some of the sources of power and authority that you have as a teacher?
Howdy. The two I wrote down are the structure of the school institution. So the way that school is structured gives teachers kind of a hierarchy of leadership, which can kind of be utilized to manage student behavior and such as I can defer a student onto my head of middle school or etc. And then I also talked about relationship with parents. I've seen a few teachers utilize their relationship with parents to kind of manage behavior and such.
Yeah, they're two very valuable ones, Josiah. And in terms of the structure, can you think, Josiah and others, of others in the school structure? Noah, who do you think are others in the school structure who have a huge influence on what the power and authority is of the teachers there? So beyond the hierarchy of the obvious leadership, the head of middle school, etc., what other people are there in the school structure?
I think one that's a little bit left field is the students, because if the students don't listen to the teacher can't do anything about that. Like, what are they going to do? Let's say the whole class is being disruptive. The teacher says, everyone be quiet. They don't do that. They're like, okay, well, if you guys can't be quiet, then you're going to stay in at recess. But if the students just go out to recess anyway, it's not like the teachers are going to go chasing them with a stick and saying, come back inside, because they can't. Like, what are they going to do? It's that understanding and almost respect and understanding of that hierarchy of leadership and that power imbalance, which isn't necessarily negative, that actually causes, which is what allows teachers to teach and to have that authority and what they say to then be followed through. But if students didn't want to listen, and students don't, like, the majority of students choose not to listen, then it's almost like that authority then in the classroom is taken away from the teachers on a physical level, because it's not like the teachers can physically restrain and or make the students listen and do what they want. They can encourage and put in consequences, but that's only understanding that then the students will attend those consequences and take that on, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, I think there's so many good points mentioned there. And as you say, if you encourage interest and you encourage engagement, then that will be important. Peer influence, I think, is also important. And so when you say that there could be use of a method of restraint, like you could stay in, what you're hoping is that the peer influence will cause the problem students to give in to the other peers. So there's a lot of dynamics going on there. And I think, as you rightly point out, the students have some authority because they're human beings. They control whether they listen, they control whether they speak. They've got a lot of responsibility there, just as a human being. And so it's worth talking through with the students what's going on, and also talking through with the group as to, if explaining if everyone speaks at once, things won't work. We all want to get the best out, have a happy environment. And so there are lots of consequences. Other consequences include grades as well. Rachel, what are your thoughts on where the power and authority lies in the class situation? We've got parents, we've got students, we've got other structures in the school. Where's the power and authority lie, Rachel?
I think a big one that's not mentioned is your teacher partner. So especially in primary school, you've always got another one or two teachers that teach your same age group, that you always are talking about curriculum and assessments and things like that. And I know it's especially prevalent in primary school, especially my school. They're very big on your teacher partner, whoever's teaching the other class of that same grade, you talk to, you communicate with, as well as in secondary, whoever teaches the same subjects around the same year level, you talk to, you communicate with, in that sense of you're putting responsibility on each other for checking that things are done. The way that my mentor teacher does it with her teacher partner is he's written all the assessment, she's written all the unit outlines. So it's split the responsibility equally, as well as things like heads of departments. So yeah, we've got the school hierarchy of especially for the students, of who's the head of year 12, who's the year 7 coordinator for kids to go to especially, but heads of departments. So the head of art. So if you're an art teacher in any capacity, you go and talk to that teacher about something that's going on within the realm of art, or the head of science, the head of, a number of different subject areas. That is kind of a go-to point, I feel like, for teachers to be able to have somebody they can rely on that's not necessarily the principal or the deputy principal, that it's someone that is kind of in charge of them, that they go to for support of something to do with their teaching.
And that's so good to realise that you also have authority from your subject expertise. So each time you talk about a subject, one would hope that the students would be excited that you have knowledge, that you have qualifications, and you've got to handle that well and communicate it in a way that's interesting. And so you can talk about the areas of expertise that you have in an interesting way. And so in science, you can open up a heart from a sheep, and you can point out these are the various things that have gone on. It doesn't always work so well. I've tried to show primary school children and my grandchildren and children my expertise and interest in earthworms and spiders, and I've discovered that they're not always persuaded by some of the areas that I claim to have expertise in. Oh no, We don't like spiders. We don't like earthworms, they will say so. But my theories about the expertise I have sometimes got me into trouble. So I've got to think carefully about areas that I claim expertise in. Otherwise, I can get into trouble. You mentioned the unit outlines and the resources. And I think because you've got access and you control the resources like art, music, interesting activities, even a trip to the library and books that can be borrowed, I think it's important as a teacher that you bring in interesting resources and you share them, because again, that gives you a sense of power and authority because you control those resources, you share those resources, and you share the interesting activities such as art activities and music activities. So be an interesting teacher and share the interesting ideas and activities you have with the students. That'll give you a sense of power and authority. I think also we should see heads of department not just as a threat where you go to when there are problems, invite them in to speak to the whole class about things that are exciting and interesting. I think we need to use a lot of carrot rather than stick. And so I think use lots of carrot in order to get the job done. So bring the head of subject in, the head of science in as well. So students do have some authority, but they also need to recognise the limitations of their authority. And they may claim to have authority to not listen, but they need to recognise there is a cost in not listening. And so you need to explain at the right time in the right way. If you don't listen, you limit your opportunities in life. And I guess as teachers will also say, you limit the opportunity of the other students in the class if you keep talking. But you need to realise there's a cost in that, in that if you keep talking and 6 other students don't receive the benefit of what's being done, you got 6 people who could be your enemy, who could really be unhappy that they're not getting the benefits. So recognise that there is a cost in being part of community. So there's lots that we could discuss there. So in these 2 classes today, we've talked about the benefits and costs of thinking in groups and thinking of individuals. And when you work with students, there are benefits and costs and dangers. When you act as an individual, you need to take responsibility as an individual, that you've got responsibility to act at times as an individual, but there are also benefits when you work with a group as well. And we need to also recognise that our thinking is done as individuals and groups, and it always has influence on the way we work. Individuals, we've got an opportunity to quickly move, quickly gather information, but we will be missing out on the contributions that others can make. Work with a group could slow you down, but there is the advantage of interacting with other people. And so we need to recognise that we're always working as individuals and we're always working with groups. You can't avoid it. You grew up in a family, you are constantly being influenced by lots of people around you, and in the city where you are, you can't avoid working in groups. We are always working with groups, but we choose which groups influence us. And I think it's important that we need to look for expertise and admit where we don't have that expertise, where we're dependent on others as well. Can I get everyone to write down now, what are some of the things that have stood out today as we've talked about working with individuals and groups, and then a reminder that next week we'll come together and we'll have an overview of the different materials that we've looked at, as we've looked at ways to become better thinkers. We've looked at the benefits of critical thinking, scientific thinking, mathematical thinking. And we've seen that God can be at work in maths and science. And then we've also looked at thinking that's beyond objective measuring of modernity, that is more subjective, and it involves storytelling and language. And then in more recent times, we've looked at some specific application in the classroom. How can you become more effective in doing that? And we've also looked at, in our assignments, how we can engage with Indigenous groups and different subject areas as well. But what stood out today? Tegan, what stood out to you today?
I think just going through the benefits and disadvantages of working in groups and individually. I did mainly think about as working in a group, you get to have different perspectives, and sometimes we don't understand something, but someone could, and that could be an advantage to working in groups. And everyone comes with different ways of knowing. So, and then I like the example you gave about a tripod with 3 legs and one that has 1 leg. And if you were to walk away from the one that had 1 leg, would it still stand up? And I think it's important that we know that it's important that we take responsibility, and thinking is important as an individual. So, yeah.
Yeah, so good. So we're going to take responsibility for our individual thinking and group thinking. And Martin Luther wrote and said so much about that. Ruben, what stood out to you today?
I think the discussion towards the end about what are my sources of authority and power as I become a teacher. And I liked how we talked about, we do have a power imbalance in the classroom that is to be used positively for students' learning. But at the same time, students have the individual choice amongst the collective class about what they want to do. They have responsibilities for their actions at the same time. And then because of that power imbalance, we're able to, in a way, regulate and provide a consequence, whether that's positive or reactive to their negative behavior, to help them learn.
I like the way you say that, Ruben, because the power imbalance goes both ways. Students have some power in order to choose, as was said quite rightly, they have power to choose whether they listen. They can look at you but not listen. But we, as the conductor of the orchestra and what is going on, we regulate and provide consequences. And I think there is a danger that if you go to your power and say, I will do this, etc., then you've not really got things working well and well-oiled in the first place. So I think it's very important that we understand the nature of the power of what's going on and what's legitimate, but also what is wise. So hard power uses force, and it says, you will stay back, there will be a detention. But soft power uses relationship, and it appeals to what is going on. That is, if you are going to learn and other students are wanting to learn, and if we want to have a harmonious place, then we need to work together. That's more of soft power, and that begins before you enter the classroom. It begins before the class starts. It begins as you begin to sell what's going to happen in the class this year. So the nature of power and authority is an important feature in any group, in any society, and many have written about the nature of power from ancient times through to more recent times. Max Weber describes 3 types of authority and power. He says that traditional authority and power looks backwards to the past. And so traditional authority and power in the classroom would say, your parents, your grandparents, your culture all value this. So that's one type of power, looking back to the past and arguing that there are people who have given you so much. Then there's charismatic authority and power, which Max Weber describes. And that is enthusiasm and excitement and interest. And that's where the teacher seeks to begin with excitement and interest. One of the dangers of charismatic power is that it's playing with emotions and experience, and it can work very well. But at times, if you've got to knuckle down and do the maths, so I think you want to get people excited about maths. You've also got to knuckle down and do the maths tasks as well. So charismatic power, says Max Weber, is all about that sense of charisma. There's a bit of car salesmanship in charismatic power, in that it says, you know, I've got all the ideas there. And then the legal rational power comes down partly to legal position that you have been given. You've been given responsibility for the students to learn. It's been recognised by the government that the learning that takes place is going to bring a job for the students when they graduate. It'll be written on their report. It'll be written in their reference that they got a grade of a credit or a distinction. And so that's going to shape the opportunities that unfold. So you can explain that to the students, that there are outcomes and that these fit within the legal rational approach. And rationally, you are older, you have knowledge, you have studied your subject area, you have knowledge, even if you don't have a great deal of knowledge at the moment, you are able to locate the information more quickly and communicate it to the students. And so for that reason, you have been given the position. And so I think it's worth being excited by the position and authority that you're given. You're paid because that authority is recognized. So there's a lot of different types of power and authority that are recognized out there. I encourage you to prayerfully be aware of the authority and power that you have. So let's commit the things we've learnt today in prayer, and I look forward to continuing to work where we can together. And I'm also very thankful and grateful for the opportunity that I've been given, the authority and power to tell you things that have hopefully been helpful along the way, and that draw on my expertise, experience from both teaching and also training over many years. And then I interact with lots of other people who have authority and power that's shared as well. So thank you, each one. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we do thank you for each student here. We're aware that as one another, as students, all of us have different personalities and abilities, but you value us, each one, and you have a bright and hope-filled future for us, each one. Guide us now, we pray. Amen. So thank you, and see you in a week's time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.